Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Leah Althauser, and I'm the Environmental Education Coordinator for Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. I use she, her pronouns. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the traditional and ancestral lands of the Nisqually peoples, who have been caretakers of this land since time immemorial. To learn more about the Nisqually peoples, please see the link in the chat. This program is part of an offering in our Wild Washington education program. Wild Washington offers lessons, events, and other fish, wildlife, and natural resource themed educational resources. And for more information on the Wild Washington education program, please see the link in the chat. Last week, we also published a lesson for 9th through 12th grade students on wildlife disease, so make sure to check that out as well. A couple quick housekeeping things before we begin. We have enabled closed captioning, but if you would like to turn it off, please click the button with the two C's in the lower right-hand corner of your toolbar, and you'll see an option for turning off those subtitles. We will not be taking verbal questions, so raised hands will not be called on, but if you have a question, please put it in the question and answer, and we will definitely get to it. I am so excited to announce today's presenter. Katie is one of our WDFW wildlife vets, and she does some really awesome things. And she's going to teach us all about her work as a wildlife vet and how she works around wildlife disease. Katie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Let me see if I can.
And I'll let you take it from there.
Okay. Can you guys see my presentation?
Not yet.
Oh, I got a screen share. Sorry. How about now? You should. Okay. You guys should all see my presentation now, right?
Yep, we see it.
Perfect. So thank you, everyone that's here today to learn a little bit more about wildlife diseases here in Washington and what a wildlife veterinarian does in general, not just in Washington, but kind of overall. So we'll spend a few minutes today talking about some different diseases here in Washington, what it is that I do as a wildlife veterinarian and how to become a wildlife veterinarian if you're interested. I do want to say that I am sorry that it didn't work out for us to have some live animals today. We ran up against some of the ongoing COVID restrictions and policies in place, so we just weren't able to coordinate that, unfortunately. But hopefully next time, if we do something like this again, focused on wildlife diseases. And so I do want to start by saying that as a wildlife veterinarian, one of the key things that I do in addition to working with wild animals and wildlife disease is collaborative teamwork in general. So as a wildlife veterinarian, we're always faced with, different species and different diseases, and there's this whole world of information that we don't really have a great handle on about wildlife animals and populations and the diseases and pathogens they face. And so working together as a collaborative team with different experts across the whole range, right? So biologists and ecologists and just a whole team to try and tackle some of the questions that face us when we talk about wildlife diseases is absolutely critical. And so I just really want to highlight that collaboration. And I think it's something that will come throughout this presentation as we talk about wildlife diseases here in Washington and also just being a wildlife veterinarian. But first, why are wildlife diseases and wildlife health important? Why do we care? And this concept of One Health is critically important to pretty much everything I do as a wildlife veterinarian. And if you're not familiar with One Health, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which we're all probably very familiar with now since we live in a pandemic world, has a lot of information on One Health. You can also just Google One Health, the One Health Institute. There's a lot of really great information out there on this concept of One Health. But basically, what One Health means is that we're all interconnected, right? Which makes sense because we all are interconnected. And so as a human, we live in this world that is connected by environmental health and the ecosystem health around us, but also our animals and the health of the animals. And we can't separate that out. Even if we live in a city and we don't think we're out in nature, we are, right? We are part of this planet and it's all interconnected. And so the health of the animals, our domestic animals and our wildlife, is directly linked to the health of the environment, which is directly linked to human health. And so because of this, wildlife health and wildlife diseases are absolutely very important to the well-being and the health of humans. And so I think you can't really talk about wildlife health and wildlife disease without bringing up zoonotic diseases. And I always mention this book by David Quayman called Spillover. It's several years old now at this point, but given the pandemic world that we live in, it is a very pointed and kind of terrifying book to read because it talks about zoonotic diseases, which are pathogens and diseases in animals that can also infect humans. And we're all very familiar with COVID-19, which is the disease that's caused by the virus SARS-CoV-2. And that is a zoonotic disease that basically spilled over from a wild animal into humans and now has resulted in this global pandemic. And so I strongly recommend this book to anyone. It's very well written. It's a very good read. Might keep you up at night some just because of the implications for human pandemics. But I also want to highlight that here in Washington, we also have plenty of zoonotic diseases, not just COVID-19. And I list some of them here, tularemia, plague, rabies, and I'm not really going to go into great detail about these specific diseases, but more just to highlight that there are quite a few zoonotic diseases that we deal with here in Washington that can spill over from the animal populations into humans and also domestic animals. And this goes back to that One Health concept, right? So why we care about wildlife disease, why we care about wildlife health, because it does have direct implications on our health and the health of humans as a member of the global ecosystem, basically. So what do wildlife veterinarians do? And I have pictured here some various pictures of what we do. And I want to highlight that these pictures are all Dr. Kristen Mansfeld. She's the lead state wildlife veterinarian for Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I'm just immensely grateful that I get to work under her because she's been an incredible mentor and teacher basically to help me in my career and just learning as a relatively new wildlife veterinarian. So it's been fantastic working with her. And you'll see here, she's taking blood from an elk for, we take blood from wildlife for a variety of reasons to obtain baseline health of, what that animal, baseline health parameters for, what their blood values are. So just like when you go to the doctor and they take a little bit of blood from you to measure various things, we do the same thing for our wildlife if we're doing captures so that we can get some baseline information on their health. And here, Dr. Mansfeld is anesthetizing a sea lion. Again, this can be done for a variety of reasons, either captures to put tags on, to do some environmental work studies and to look at the role of these animals in the ecosystem. We could look at long-term survival with them, but the role of the veterinarian in these type of capture situations is really to ensure the animal's health and safety and to make sure the captures are safe and the animal is handled well, and that we also can collect some information and data for baseline health. This picture here in the middle is an image of a helicopter dropping off some mountain goats in the Olympic National Park. Some of you may be familiar with the work that was ongoing several years ago to translocate the mountain goats from the Olympic National Parks over to the Cascades, the North Cascades, because mountain goats are not native to the Olympic National Park ecosystem, and they were actually having quite detrimental impacts on the ecosystem. And so there is this massive multi-agency collaboration to move these animals, as many of these animals as we could, over to the North Cascades where they are native and they could actually have positive impacts on that ecosystem in the North Cascades because that's where they're from. And then here, I apologize for a little bit of blood and gore, but I also really want to highlight that conducting necropsies on dead animals is very, very important aspect of our job and what we do as wildlife veterinarians. And a necropsy is basically an autopsy that we do on but it's done on an animal, right? Or done on a non-human animal. So it's a necropsy is conducting an autopsy on a non-human animal. And we do that for a variety of reasons: to take samples, to try and figure out why the animal died, for research purposes, to try and figure out what pathogens may be present, because it's a really good indication of what might be in that population when we have the chance to conduct a necropsy on a dead animal. So, and another thing that we do as a wildlife veterinarian is we respond to emerging diseases. And one of the big emerging diseases here in Washington for our wildlife is white nose syndrome. And if you're not familiar with white nose syndrome, it's a fungus that infects hibernating bats. And it's not a native fungus to North America. So it was introduced to North America, first found in New York in the mid 2000s. And has since made its way across much of North America. And in 2016, we unfortunately found it. Here's a picture from Paws Wildlife Center, looking at the very first case of a bat with white nose syndrome here in Washington. Thankfully, the veterinarians at Paws were able to identify that this bat looked abnormal, and we were able to submit samples, and unfortunately it came back as white nose syndrome, or the fungus that causes it. And we have since launched into this massive surveillance and monitoring plan across the state, trying to figure out where the fungus is. The Pseudomonas destructans, or PD, is the fungus that causes white nose syndrome. And so we've launched into this massive monitoring and surveillance effort to try and document where it may be across Washington so that we can manage it and hopefully mitigate it and conserve our bats, because bats do have great ecosystem services, right? So they eat insects, and a lot of the insects that they eat are pests to crops or forestry pests. And so the decline of bats across North America has in turn had a really big impact, negative impact, on pests and bugs that eat crops and forests and things. And so what I'm showing here in this picture on the left-hand side of the screen, these little orange dots under UV fluorescence, that is where the fungus has infected the wings of this bat. And so basically what happens, the bats are hibernating, the fungus grows all over them. It is irritating, because having a fungus grow all over you would be irritating and itchy. It makes them rouse from hibernation. And then they're hungry, right? Because it's the middle of wintertime and they don't have the resources that they need to forage. And so the result of being woken up from hibernation is that they starve to death, and then they die, they succumb to the infection. And I just want to highlight here that there's this recent study that came out that showed that 3 main species of bats in North America have declined by 90% because of white nose syndrome. That is a significant loss in those species. 90% mortality rate is absolutely tremendous. And so here in Washington, we are trying to mitigate that disease risk and try and protect our bats and conserve them so that we hopefully don't see that loss of bats in our state. Another disease that I just want to highlight real quickly, or disease outbreak in Washington that is kind of ongoing, lingering a little bit, and this is a disease that Dr. Mansfeld has been managing and responding to and working with partners on, is a salmonella outbreak in Washington songbirds. And salmonella is a zoonotic disease. It's a bacteria that can make you very sick, and it makes birds very sick. It can make a lot of animals very sick, but it can make songbirds very sick. And so what I'm showing here in this graph is just a number of reported sick and dead birds. And you can see that early December, we had a handful of reports, and then in January, it really peaked before it's kind of dropped off, and we're now seeing this tail of just like a lingering few being reported. And this outbreak, we think, has been related to what's called an eruption of pine siskins. So basically a bunch of pine siskins, which is a little songbird, that are normally further north, were a bit further south because of environmental conditions. And because of environmental conditions and all these massive numbers of birds, they were flocking to bird feeders. And salmonella is a bacteria that's frequently present in feces. And so with all these birds on the bird feeders, they were defecating and then being exposed to that feces. And so they were transmitting salmonella amongst themselves. And we've had this huge, massive outbreak, over 3,000 birds reported sick and dead. And so Kristen, Dr. Mansfield worked to put guidances out for the state and the areas that were hit the hardest for people to take down their bird feeders and wash their bird feeders with a bleach solution to try and stop this outbreak. And as you can see, it is still slightly ongoing. And so there's still some management actions being taken to manage the outbreak in songbirds in Washington. And one more example before I launch into discussing how to become a wildlife vet is looking at blue tongue virus outbreak in deer in Washington in 2015. And again, this is an outbreak or an epizootic that Dr. Mansfield worked with. And here on this graph, similar to what I showed with the pine siskin salmonella outbreak or songbird salmonella outbreak, you see the report of dead and sick deer. And you can see that, September in the early fall, there's a handful of reports, and that really peaks in the, I guess mid to late September, and then drops off as we move into colder months. And so blue tongue virus is a virus that has a gnat vector, so an insect vector. So basically the virus will be inside of the gnat. And then when the gnat bites the deer, it transmits the virus. And there is a relationship between blue tongue virus outbreaks and environmental conditions. So there's some thought that, during drought years when deer are congregating around smaller pools of water and they're closer together, that the outbreak, environmental conditions are right such that the outbreak can result in this epizootic and a really big number of sick and dead deer being found and reported. And there's also the seasonality and the epizootics. You'll note here that, late, I guess, early October-ish, it really drops off. And the reason for that is we had a really hard freeze, which was thought to kill the gnat vector. And so that kind of stopped the spread of the disease, which we can see here with the drop off and the mortalities. And again, I think this is a good example of One Health, because it's a disease that's related to the environment, and it's also in seasonality issues, and it's also a disease that can impact livestock. So it's a blue tongue virus can also infect and result in mortality of cattle. And so it's also a really good reminder that, hey, we're all interconnected. These viruses and these pathogens that we see out on the landscape affecting our wildlife can also affect our domestic animals and have an impact on humans. Okay, so with that in mind, and all kind of the brief review of the overall work that wildlife veterinarians do, how do you become a wildlife veterinarian if this is something you're interested in? And it's a long road. I will say that it's many years of school. But I think first and foremost, if you are interested in becoming a wildlife veterinarian, it's really important to become acquainted with what the work is. There's some really great books out there. I just have 2 listed here. There's a lot more than this, but Rhino with the Glue-On Shoes is a really fantastic book that's kind of a compilation of different essays from wildlife and zoo veterinarians. And so I think it gives a pretty good idea of some of the types of cases that you may see and just what it means to work in the world of zoo and wildlife medicine. And then Appointment at the Ends of the World is kind of an older book at this point. It's written by Dr. Billy Koresh, who is with EcoHealth Alliance and the Wildlife Conservation Society. And it's about his time as a wildlife veterinarian for the Wildlife Conservation Society. And so it's just this really phenomenal book showing, showing his work and what he did as a wildlife veterinarian several decades ago. So I think just becoming acquainted, realizing that a lot of what we do is actually computer work. You saw those graphs that I was showing you from the blue tongue outbreak and the salmonella outbreak. A lot of what we do is talking to private citizens and discussing, what they're seeing with sick and dead wildlife around their property, or taking reports of sick and dead wildlife, or making, coordinating, getting the carcass of a dead animal into a diagnostic laboratory so we can get more information. And then analyzing data, right? Like you see these cool pictures of, oh, wow, look at this fun work that's being done. And it's, yes, we do get to do this, but we also spend a fair bit of time in front of the computer. So I think being aware of that is really important. And you can learn some of these aspects by volunteering, right? Working with small and large animal veterinarians, learning what it's like to be a domestic animal veterinarian, because it's really important that you have that skill set, even though you're working with wildlife. Because you'll see here, the wildlife that I'm working with, they're anesthetized, right? So we have to, because wildlife are wild, we have to typically fully anesthetize them or sedate them, or here with this mountain goat kit, manually restrain it. And so that's very stressful for the animal. So the work that we do, we have to be really good at it and really efficient with it. So it has to be done quickly. So having some background and training in small animal, large animal medicine is critical, so that you have that skill set to do the work quickly. And I want to ask, I know that you can't really speak up in this presentation the way it is, but if anyone, the first person to put in the chat what this animal is, if you're a student, I will do homework for you for one day. So if anyone knows what this is, and then in the Q&A session, we will hop back in, I'll tell you, we can talk about it some more, but I'm curious to know if folks can identify that animal. It's one of my absolute favorite animals. And then just to reiterate the whole lot of school aspect, it's a whole lot of school. So you have to have a 4-year degree. Most folks get a Bachelor of Science focused on biology. Not that you don't have to have a Bachelor of Science, but there are prerequisite classes you have to have. Most vets get a Master's of Science or some level of graduate school before going to vet school. It really helps because getting into vet school is very, very competitive, because there's not very many veterinary schools in the US. And then you have your 4 years to become a doctor of veterinary medicine, and the curriculum and the training for a veterinarian is pretty much exactly the same as a medical doctor, a human medical doctor. It's just focused on many animals instead of one for veterinary medicine. And then a lot of veterinarians, wildlife veterinarians, do other graduate schooling, either a PhD or 4 or 5 years of a residency, internships and residencies. So overall, you're looking at probably 12 to 15 years of higher education once you finish high school. So just, it's a long haul. And then also consider the job realities. I think it's really important to just highlight, I mean, I think most people are aware of the student loan debt crisis right now, and veterinarians are pretty hard hit by the student loan crisis. So you have to consider the financial implications. Vet school is very expensive. Most people have to take out a lot of student loans, and wildlife veterinarians don't get paid very much. So just keeping that in mind, right, that there are these financial implications. Keeping in mind, thinking about the job responsibilities and the job duties. Again, here, another picture of a necropsy. This is a black rhinoceros. At the time, it was one of the oldest black rhinoceroses in North America, and she died. And I was lucky enough to be able to participate in the necropsy to try and figure out why she died. And so I think just keeping in mind that you will be dealing with some, blood and gore aspects, but again, it's the result of doing those things is so that you can learn more about the animal, the individual case, why the animal may have died, but also about the greater population and what pathogens may be present in the population. You also will be dealing with a fairly large number of sick or dead wild animals for wildlife medicine, because unless we're immobilizing or anesthetizing animals, for the most part, a lot of what we see as a wildlife vet is actually a sick or dead animal already. And again, that goes back to the necropsy and trying to figure out, it's a great learning opportunity to try and figure out what pathogens are present in the environment. And then I just have this here to highlight that there's often a lot of remote work. So just being aware that you're going to be removed from your family sometimes. So let me check my time. Leah, how am I doing on time?
We're good. We have about 10 minutes before we go to Q&A.
Okay, so perfect.
You can use it all or use not as much.
Sure. No, I think I have about 10 minutes left to talk about turtles and shell disease, because I think that was one of the things that was promised. And it also is, for me, is a really great example of the collaboration that goes into understanding wildlife disease. So yeah, let's talk about turtles and shell disease for just a few minutes. So I think I just said this, but The Western pond turtle shell disease issue here in Washington is a really phenomenal example of a collaborative approach to wildlife disease. And I know that this is, this is just one example, but I know like Dr. Mansfeld working with elk hoof disease and some of the other diseases that she works directly with would have a very similar story, right? So when we work with these wildlife diseases like this, it's a huge collaborative effort. And you can see here, all of these different logos are entities that we work directly with and trying to understand more about shell disease in Western pond turtles. So just a little bit about our Western pond turtle or Northwestern pond turtle. They are one of 2 native turtles for Washington. So that's pretty cool, right? We only have 2 turtles here, and Western pond turtles are one of those 2. They are listed as state endangered, and we've had really successful recovery efforts since they were listed as state endangered, with now over 800 turtles at 6 sites. So when they were listed as state endangered in the 90s, there was only about 150 turtles at 2 sites. And so we've been really successful in recovering these turtles. However, we have a shell disease that is now affecting our turtles. And from what the research that we've done, we know that it affects about 80% of the turtles across all 6 populations. So even though we've had really successful recovery efforts, we're now faced with this shell disease. And just to show you what shell disease looks like, here on the right, this is a picture of a very healthy, nice looking carapace of a Western pond turtle. You can see it's nice and shiny. It looks really healthy. There's no bleaching or pits or lesions. And then here on the left is a picture of a turtle with shell disease. And this is an extremely severe case. So not all of our turtles with shell disease look this bad, but you can see this dark area here and all of these areas here would be lesions that penetrate down into the coelomic cavity. So basically a lesion that goes all the way into the shell or through the shell into the inner body of the turtle. And so it can be quite a gnarly disease. We have, through the collaborative work that we've been doing, we have determined that our shell disease in our pond turtles is associated with a fungus. And it's the fungus is Imidamyces testavorans. And what's interesting about this fungus is it's very closely related to the fungus that causes snake fungal disease. So if you just Google snake fungal disease, there's a lot of information out there. Thankfully, we don't have snake fungal disease here in Washington yet, but snake fungal disease is another fungus that affects snakes, obviously, but has really negatively impacted some snakes like rattlesnakes across eastern North America. This fungus has been documented to be associated with several other species of turtles, so it's not just here in Washington. It is a widespread pathogen. And so I want to spend a few minutes talking about computed tomography and what it is, because have we been able to be live? Well, we are live, but have we been able to be at the VCA or veterinary hospital today with live turtles? You guys would have seen some turtles that had just been CT scanned. And the reason why we do CT scans is so that we get a better image of the shell disease. And so here on the left, this is a picture of a radiograph. I think we're all familiar with radiographs or x-rays, basically where it's a machine that passes x-rays through a body, and the white area is bone, and the black areas would be air or lack of bone or soft tissue, depending on the varying darkness. And so what a CT scan is this big machine that basically takes radiographs on a slice. So we wrap up our turtles and we put them on this thing that slides it through the CT scan, and we get these slices of our turtles, which you can see an example of here on the right-hand side of the screen. And so it gives us a much better image of the shell disease. And it's, you can see the arrows here pointing to lesions, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. I just wanted to show this this image from a paper we published recently with some CT scans. Here on the left, this is a healthy turtle. So nice, bright white bone. You can see these dark spaces here are the space between the ribs. So this is their backbone here, and this would be the ribs. It's actually the carapace, but the ribs form the carapace. Here is a turtle with mild shell disease, and these dark areas would be those pitting lesions that I mentioned. And on the plastron, which is the belly or underside of the turtle, you can see a lot more of those lesions. And then here on the right would be a severe turtle. And you can see that it's just completely pockmarked with lesions. And just so you guys can see, this is going to be a video that's going to start at the close to the head of the turtle and slice wise go through the turtle for a few slices. And I just wanted to show you basically what a CT scan looks like as it goes through the turtle. And you can see these areas, the dark areas here, those are all lesions that penetrate into the coelomic cavity. And this would be the coelomic cavity. Up here would be the lungs. And I'll play that again just so you guys can see. So this is what we're looking at when we go through these CT scans, slice by slice by slice, basically, and we're counting the lesions and looking at how severe the disease is for these turtles. And this work is all done in collaboration with veterinary radiologists, so veterinarians who became specialized in radiology, so CT scans and MRIs and ultrasounds and things like that. At a veterinary hospital, the VCA in Linwood, and then there's a VCA in Clackamas, Oregon. And their radiologists work very closely with us to do these CT scans and help us interpret them. We also do medical treatment of pond turtle shell disease, and here on the left is a pre-surgery turtle, and then here on the right would be post-surgery, and all of these lesions have been what's called debrided out. So the turtle is under anesthesia, so fully anesthetized, and then the lesions are debrided, or basically the dead tissue is removed so that you then have a healthy tissue plane to start with regrowth of the bone and the keratin. And again, highly collaborative. These surgeries are done either at Paws Wildlife Center by the veterinarians at Paws, or the Oregon Zoo and the veterinarians at the Oregon Zoo. And so we've worked closely with those veterinarians, because they do a lot more clinical work than I do, to develop the protocol for appropriate anesthesia and appropriate pain medicine. Because as you can imagine, this, post-debridement would be quite painful. What medicines to use and all of that. And we are also doing research to look at potential antifungal treatments. And so just another aspect of this highly collaborative approach. And our goal with all of this is to have healthy populations and species recovery. So that's our goal with pond turtles. That's our goal as a wildlife veterinarian across the board with any taxa that we work with, right? Our goal is to help maintain healthy populations and species recovery when we're dealing with management and conservation. And I think it's absolutely critical, again, to highlight that these are collaborative efforts, right? As a veterinarian, especially working with wildlife, you're collaborating with wildlife biologists, because the wildlife biologists are the ones, capturing the animals. Like for the turtles, they're the ones putting the traps out and capturing the animals. I'm working with private veterinarians who do small animal medicine, but are better at surgeries than I am. So it's just it's a very collaborative approach to trying to maintain healthy wildlife populations so that we can manage them correctly and have species recovery. And I have this picture here because I think it's really cool. It's a slice of a CT scan of a turtle, but what we're looking at here would be calcified eggs. So this female has 5 eggs that she's going to lay probably pretty soon because they're calcified. And I think with that, we can launch into any questions folks might have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie. That was really informative, and I learned a lot, and I'm considering going back through all those years of school, because this just seems like such a cool career.
It is worth it.
We do have a few questions for you. Sure. Our first one is, what does sylvatic plague do to animals?
That's a good question. So plague is obviously carried by animals. Depending on the animal that is carrying the plague, you may see different effects, right? So similar to humans, say if a cat has plague, you may see very similar signs. So they would have a fever, they would be inappetent or not have much of an appetite, basically flu-like symptoms, right? That we would see in a human that may have plague.
Thank you. Our next question is, what are the stages of rabies?
Stages of rabies. I guess I would, not sure I understand the question. Is it more asking about the animal hosts that it goes into, or how it infects humans? If there can be some clarification, or I can just take a stab at answering it and then they can ask further questions. So rabies is also a zoonotic disease. It is typically carried by bats. Bats seem to be the most common vector that we talk about, although in other areas, like in the southeast United States, like foxes and raccoons and other warm-blooded animals can also carry rabies. Bats tend to be asymptomatic, so that means that a lot of times they won't have symptoms of rabies, but it's a virus that lives basically along the nerves within and around the salivary glands. And that's why you always think about rabies, you think about being bitten by a rabid animal, right? Because it affects them neurologically. And then when they bite you, it's passed on, the virus is passed on through their saliva. And if a human is infected or bitten by a rabid animal, we now have really great treatment. So prophylactic treatment that humans can undergo that thankfully can prevent us from getting rabies, because prior to that treatment, rabies is considered very deadly, right? There's really no cure for it. And so I'm not sure if that answers their question. If not, ask follow-up questions.
Thank you. What diseases can elephants get?
That is really a good question. There's a lot of diseases that elephants can get. One of the most common diseases that we talk about with elephants would be tuberculosis. And tuberculosis is also a zoonotic disease that basically infects the lungs and results in, it can have widespread effects on the whole body, but for an elephant, it can be really detrimental. It's one of those diseases that takes a very long time to manifest itself. And so an animal can be infected with tuberculosis for a while and then over time kind of slowly decline. I think that elephants, there's also a number of other diseases that affect elephants. I also think that some of the biggest issues facing elephants would be habitat destruction and overall ecosystem impacts from having that loss of habitat.
Yeah, that makes sense. And sometimes I correct me if I'm wrong, but things like loss of habitat can influence disease even further.
Absolutely. Yep. That's a really good point. So we know that with loss of habitat, there's a variety of things that can happen with wild populations, but either they may become more confined to smaller areas. And so there's more animals in a smaller place, and therefore they can spread disease around themselves more. They can also, the stress of the lack of habitat or loss of habitat can result in being more susceptible to diseases. And then loss of habitat also has, direct implications on their ability to forage and to find food that they need that can help them be, healthy because they have appropriate diets.
Thank you. You mentioned the salmonella outbreak happened because pine siskins migrated to an area more south than usual. Does that mean that they would have been more spread out and the risk of outbreak would have been reduced if they migrated further north of Washington?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. That's kind of the theory, right? Is that because of what's called an eruption in these animals, so basically it's the population density of an animal is changed because of environmental conditions that cause them to move, right? And so the thought is, there may be more pine siskins on the environment or on the landscape in the first place, or it's environmental conditions up in their northern ranges where they would have been that pushes them further south, or vice versa, right? Wherever they may have been for a variety of reasons, whether or not there was actually, more siskins on the landscape where they initially were that pushed them out to their farther edges. But yeah, that's basically what happened, is that there is a lot more pine siskins in the area for all of those different reasons. And because of that, they were congregating at bird feeders because it was wintertime, right? And there's less forage on the landscape and they were getting easy food basically and congregating at these bird feeders. And because of that, becoming more exposed to each other and to the salmonella that they were, some of them were shedding, and then resulted in this big outbreak.
Thank you. Our next few questions are about pond turtles. So do Western pond turtles, does their behavior change when they get shell disease? How did the disease originate and how does it spread?
Those are very good questions. So as far as we know, for the behavior, we don't think their behavior changes. We're not 100% sure of that. There's some thought that they may bask more. So basically turtles, reptiles in general, will bask in the sunshine because they're cold-blooded, right? So they need sunshine and warmth to help them thermoregulate. So there's some thought that if they're sick with shell disease, they will bask more so that they bring their body temperature up more and their immune system is better, can work better. But we haven't proven that. That's just observational. For the most part, from what I've seen, these turtles, their shell may look like Swiss cheese, but they are acting normal. They're still reproducing. They still have eggs. They're still doing their turtle thing, even though they have these horrible lesions on them. And then where it came from, that's another good question. We're trying to figure that out. There's some indication that it might be associated with captivity, but we don't know that. So our pond turtles, part of our recovery efforts for our pond turtles were to have a captive breeding program and then to head start hatchlings as well so that they grow larger and reach a size where they can avoid predation. And so there's some thought and some indication that it might be associated with captivity. That's a really hard thing to pin down though, because most of our turtles have spent some time in captivity over the course of their lives. And we also have truly wild turtles that have never been in captivity that also have shell disease. And then how it's spread, that's also a good question. At this point, we don't really know. We don't know if it's what we would call communicable, right? Where they would spread it to each other. We suspect it is given the prevalence, but we don't know at this point.
It sounds like there's a lot of room for someone to become a vet and help you figure it out.
Yes, indeed.
Do turtles ever shed their shells?
Yeah, well, yes, they don't shed their entire shell. So the bony part of their shell is covered by what's called scutes or keratin. Some species of turtle do shed those scutes. Western pond turtles are not one of those turtles. Red-eared sliders, which most people are familiar with as pets, they do shed their scutes. So I think it just depends on the species, but they will shed the keratin, but not their entire shell.
Interesting. Are there any visible signs of tuberculosis or chronic wasting disease? And I don't know if they mean in the animals specifically or in the populations.
Yeah, so no. If you mean in the populations, no. We haven't seen evidence or observed that there is CWD or TB.
Thank you. Did you ever figure out what sickness the rhinoceros got?
Yeah, actually, she had metastatic cancer, which we think came from her ovaries, which means she was a very, very old rhinoceros and died of cancer.
Wow. So the only two answers we got in for your mystery animal was a horse and a zebra.
Oh, yeah. Neither are correct. It's an okapi.
And can you tell us a little about what okapi is? Yeah,
so if you Google okapi, you'll find all kinds of beautiful pictures. So okapi is basically the only other living giraffe. It's a member of the giraffe family. And they're amazing animals. They have these super long tongues that can lick their eyeballs. They communicate similar to giraffes. They have kind of an ultrasonic way of communicating, and they just have this really beautiful red coat. So the front half is red, and then the back, their butt basically is striped. They're native to the Republic of Congo in Africa. And they're kind of this huge success story where with all of the wars that were going on and civil wars in that area, their habitat was being completely destroyed. And so there was this massive conservation effort to go in and to teach the native people of that area how to care for the ecosystem and care for the okapi. And it's just a really great success story for conservation and wildlife management and disease. And so it's one of my favorite animals.
It's neat that you got to work with us.
It is. It definitely is.
So I think our final question for you, as humans and wildlife become more interconnected, can you describe how we can prevent the spread of disease?
That's the $1 million question. I think that there's a lot that we can do as humans, just being aware of the interface, right? So it's a great question, and it's very pointed given the pandemic that we're all living in now, right? So I think there are things that can be done here in Washington with the overlap of wildlife and domestic animals, and trying to protect that overlap, right? A good example is, bighorn sheep and pneumonia between domestic animals and bighorn sheep. And then for the broader global community, I think, we can be really cognizant of wildlife trafficking and wet markets and where we get our products, right? So does this product that we purchased that came from another country, can we trace it back and know if it came from wildlife trafficking, or if it was in somehow or another involved in wildlife trafficking? I think just being more aware of our own actions and where those interfaces between what we do may be impacting wildlife and wildlife populations within Washington and beyond will go an incredibly long way.
Katie, this has been absolutely phenomenal. I've learned so much, and I hope everyone watching has as well. I just want to thank you so much for your time and taking the time to talk to us about wildlife disease. And it's clear that it's a passion.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And I will say, my email was on the presentation I gave. And if anybody has follow-up questions or anything, don't hesitate to reach out to me by email. I'm always happy to discuss anything.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks for your availability.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to
Take
all
care.
that joined us. Bye.
Bye.